Hello, I am continuing with the third chapter. The name of the chapter is the European penetration and the British conquest of India. This is the fifth part of this chapter, dual system of administration of Bengal. So let's start. Dual system of administration of Bengal. The East India Company became the real master of Bengal, at least from 1765. Its army was in sole control of its defense, and the supreme political power was in its hands. The Nawab depended for his internal and external security on the British. As the Diwan, the company directly collected its revenues, while through the right to nominate the deputy Subedar, it controlled the Nizamat or the police and judicial powers. This arrangement is known in history as the dual or double government. It held a great advantage for the British. They had power without responsibility. The Nawab and his officials had the responsibility of administration but not the power to discharge it. The weaknesses of the government could be blamed on the Indians while its fruits were gathered by the British. The consequences for the people of Bengal were disastrous. Neither the company nor the Nawab cared for their welfare. The company's servants now had the whole of Bengal to themselves, and their oppressions of the people increased greatly. We can quote Clive himself. I shall only say that such a scene of anarchy, confusion, bribery, corruption, and extortion was never seen or heard of in any country but Bengal, nor such and so many fortunes acquired in so unjust and rapacious a manner. The three provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, producing a clear revenue of £3 million sterling, have been under the absolute management of the company's servants ever since Mir Jafar's restoration to the Subahship, and they have both civil and military exacted and levied contribution from every man of power and consequences from the Nawab down to the lowest Jamindar. The company's authority on their part set out to gather the rich harvest and drain Bengal of its wealth. They stopped sending money from England to purchase Indian goods. Instead, they purchased these goods from the revenues of Bengal and sold them abroad. These were known as the company's investment and formed a part of its profits. On top of all this British government wanted to share the rich prize, and 1767 ordered the company to pay it 4 lakh pound per year. In the year 1766, 1767 and 1768 alone, nearly 5.77 million pounds were drained from Bengal. The abuses of the dual government and the drain of wealth led to the impoverishment and exhaustion of the unlucky province. In 1770, Bengal suffered a famine which, in its effects, proved to be one of the most terrible famines known in human history. People died in lakhs, and nearly one third of Bengal's population fell victim to its ravages. Though the famine was due to the failure of the rains, its effects were heightened by the company's policies. Then Wars under Warren Hastings. He was the Governor General from 1770 to 85, and Cornwallis 1786 to 93. Warren Hastings and Cornwallis. The East India Company had by 1772 become an important Indian power, and its directors in England and officials in India set out to consolidate their control over Bengal before beginning a new round of conquest. However, their habit of interfering the internal affairs of the Indian states and their lust for territory and money soon involved them in series of wars. In 1766, they joined the Nizam of Hyderabad in attacking Hyder Ali of Mysore. But Hyder Ali forced the Madras Council to sign a peace treaty on his terms. Then, in 1775, the English clashed with the Marathas. An intense struggle for the power was taking place at that time among the Marathas between the supporters of the infant Peshwa Madhavrao II, led by Nana Phadnis and Raghunath Rao. The British officials in Bombay decided to intervene on behalf of Raghunath Rao. They hoped thus to repeat the exploits of their countrymen in Madras and Bengal and reap the consequent monetary advantages. This involved them in a long war with the Marathas, which lasted from 1775 to 1782. This was a dark hour indeed for British power in India. All the Maratha chiefs were united behind the Peshwa and his Chief Minister Nana Phadnis. The southern India powers had long been resenting the presence of the British among them, and Hyder Ali and the Nizam chose this moment to declare war against the company. Thus, the British were faced with the powerful combination of the Marathas, Mysore, and Hyderabad. Abroad, they were waging a losing war in their colonies in America, where the people had rebelled in 1776. They also had to counter the determined design of the French to exploit the difficulties of their old rival. The British in India were, however, led at this time by the energetic and experienced Governor General Warren Hastings. He acted with firm resolve and determination. Neither side won the war came to standstill. Peace was concluded in 1782 with the Treaty of Salbai, by which the status quo was maintained. It saved the British from the combined opposition of Indian powers. These were known in history as the First Anglo-Maratha War. Did not end in victory for either side, but it did give the British 20 years of peace with Marathas, the strongest Indian power of the day. The British utilized this period to consolidate their rule over the Bengal presidency, while the Maratha chiefs filtered away their energy in bitter mutual squabbles. Moreover, the Treaty of Salbai enabled the British to exert pressure on Mysore, as the Marathas promised to help them in recovering their territories from Hyder Ali. Once again, the British had succeeded in dividing the Indian power. Meanwhile, war with Hyder Ali had again started in 1780. Repeating his earlier exploits, Hyder Ali inflicted one defeat after another on the British armies in the Carnatic and forced them to surrender in large numbers. He soon occupied almost the whole of the Carnatic, but once again British arms and diplomacy saved the day. Warren Hastings bribed the Nizam with the cession of Guntur district and gained his withdrawal from the anti-British alliance. During 1781 to 1782, he made peace with the Marathas and thus freed a large part of his army for use against Mysore. In July 1781, the British army under Ayr Kute defeated Hyder Ali at Porto Novo and saved Madras. After Hyder Ali's death in December 1782, the war was carried on by his son Tipu Sultan. Since neither side was capable of overpowering the other, peace was signed between them in March 1784 and both sides restored all conquests. Thus, though the British had been shown to be too weak to defeat either the Marathas or Mysore, they had certainly proved their ability to hold their own India. The British encounter with Mysore was more fruitful from the British point of view. The peace of 1784 had not removed the ground for struggle between Tipu and the British. It had merely postponed the struggle. The authorities of the East India Company were acutely hostile to Tipu. They looked upon him as their most formidable rival in the south and as the chief obstacle standing between them and complete domination over South India. Tipu, on his part, thoroughly disliked the English, saw them as the chief danger to his own independence and nursed the ambition to expel them from India. War between the two began again in 1789 and ended in Tipu's defeat in 1792 by the Treaty of Seringamapatnam. Tipu ceded half his territories to the English and their allies and paid 330 lakhs of rupees as indemnity. Then, expansion under Lord Wallesley. He was a governor general from 1798 to 1805. Lord Wallesley was a governor of India. The next large-scale expansion of British rule in India occurred during the governor generalship of Lord Wallesley, who came to India in 1798 at a time when the British were locked in a life and death struggle with France all over the world. Till then, the British had followed the policy of consolidating Till then, the British had followed the policy of consolidating their gains and resources in India and making territorial gains only when this could be done safely without antagonizing the major Indian powers. Lord Wallesley decided that the time was ripe for bringing as many Indian states as possible under British control. By 1797, the two strongest Indian powers, Mysore and Marathas, had declined in power. Political conditions in India were propitious for a policy of expansion. Aggression was easy as well as profitable. To achieve his political aims, Wallesley relied on three methods: the system of subsidiary alliance, outright war, and the assumption of the territories of previously subordinated rulers, while the practice of helping an Indian ruler with a paid British force was quite old. It was given definite shape by Wallesley, who used it to subordinate the Indian state to the paramount authority of the company. Under his subsidiary alliance system, the ruler of the allying Indian state was compelled to accept the permanent stationing of British force within his territory and to pay a subsidy for its maintenance. All this was done allegedly for his protection, but was in fact a form through which the Indian ruler paid tribute to the company. Sometimes the ruler ceded part of his territory instead of paying annual subsidy. The subsidiary treaty usually also insisted that the Indian rulers agree to the posting at his court of a British resident that he not employ any European in his service without the approval of the British, and that he not negotiate with any other Indian ruler without consulting the Governor General. In return, the British undertook to defend the ruler from his enemies. They also promised non interference in the internal affairs of the allied state, but this was a promise they seldom kept. In reality, by signing a subsidiary alliance, an Indian state virtually signed away its independence. It lost the right of self defense, of maintaining diplomatic relations, of employing foreign exports, and of settling its disputes with its neighbors. In fact, the Indian ruler lost all vestige of sovereignty in external matters and became increasingly subservient to the British resident, who interfered in the day to day administration of the state. In addition, the system tended to bring about the internal decay of the protected state. The cost of the subsidiary force provided by the British was very high and, in fact, much beyond the paying capacity of the state. The payment of the arbitrarily fixed and artificially bloated subsidy invariably disrupted the economy of the state and impoverished its people. The system of subsidiary alliance also led to the disbanding of the armies of the protected states. Lakhs of soldiers and officers were deprived of their livelihood, spreading misery and degradation in the country. Moreover, the rulers of protected states tended to neglect the interest of their people and to oppress them. As they no longer feared them, they had no incentive to be good rulers as they were fully protected by the British from domestic and foreign enemies. The subsidiary alliance system was, on the other hand, extremely advantageous to the British. They could now maintain a large army at the cost of Indian states. This enabled them to fight wars far away from their own territories, since any war would occur in the territories either of the British ally or of the British enemy. They controlled the defense and foreign relations of the protected ally and had a powerful force stationed at the very heart of his lands, and could therefore, at a time of their choosing, overthrow him and annex his territories by declaring him inefficient as far as British were concerned. The system of subsidiary alliance was, in the words of British writer, a system of fattening allies as we fatten oxen will till they were worth of being devoured. Lord Wallesley signed his subsidiary treaties with Nizam of Hyderabad in 1798 and 1800. In lieu of cash payment for the subsidiary forces, the Nizam ceded part of his territories to the company. The Nawab of Awadh was forced to sign a subsidiary treaty in 1801. Return for a larger subsidiary force, the Nawab was made to surrender to the British nearly half of his kingdom, consisting of Rohilkhand and the territory lying between the Ganga and the Jamuna. His own army was virtually disbanded, and the British had the right to station their troops in any part of his state. Wallesley dealt with Mysore, Carnatic, Tanjore, and Surat even more sternly. Tipu of Mysore would of course never agree to a subsidiary treaty. On the contrary, he was not reconciled to the loss of half of his territory in 1792. He worked incessantly in strengthening his force for the inevitable struggle with the British. He entered into negotiations for an alliance with revolutionary France. He sent missions to Afghanistan, Arabia, and Turkey to forge an anti-British alliance. The British army attacked and defeated Tipu in a brief fierce war in 1799 before French help could reach him. Tipu still refused to beg for peace on humiliating terms. He proudly declared that it was Better to die like a soldier than to live a miserable dependent on the infidels. In the list of their pensioned Rajas and Nawabs, he met a hero's end on 4 May 1799 while defending his capital Srirangapatnam. His army remained loyal to him to the very end. Nearly half of Tipu's dominions were divided between the British and their ally, the Nizam. The reduced kingdom of Mysore was restored to the descendants of the original Rajas from whom Hyder Ali had seized power. A special treaty of subsidiary alliance was imposed on the new Raja, by which the Governor General was authorized to take over the administration of the state in case of necessity. Mysore was in fact made a complete dependency of the company. In 1801, Lord Wallesley forced a new treaty upon the puppet Nawab of Carnatic, compelling him to cede his kingdom to the company in return for pension. The Madras Presidency, as it existed till 1947, was now created by attaching the Carnatic to territories seized from Mysore, including the Malabar. Similarly, the territories of the rulers of Tanjore and Surat were taken over and their rulers pensioned off. The Marathas were the only major Indian power left outside the sphere of British control. Wallesley now turned his attention towards Torn and began aggressive interference with their internal affairs. The Maratha Empire at this time consisted of a confederacy of five big chiefs, namely Peshwa at Pune, the Gaikwad at Baroda, Sindhya at Gwalior, the Holkar at Indore, and the Bhonsle at Nagpur. The Peshwa being the nominal head of the confederacy, but all of them were engaged in bitter fratricidal strife, blind to the real danger from the rapidly advancing foreigner. Wallesley had repeatedly Wallesley had repeatedly offered a subsidiary alliance to the Peshwa and Sindhya, but the far-sighted Nana Fadnis had refused to fall into the trap. However, when in 25 October 1802, the day of the great festival of Diwali, Holkar defeated the combined armies of Peshwa and Sindhia, Peshwa Bajirai too rushed into the arms of English and on the fateful last day of 1802 signed a subsidiary treaty of Basin. The victory had been a little too easy and Wallesley was wrong in one respect. The proud Maratha chiefs would not surrender their great tradition of independence without a struggle. But even in this moment of their peril, they would not unite against their common enemy. When Sindhya and Bhonsle fought the British, Holkar stood on the sidelines and Gaikwad gave help to the British. When Holkar took up arms, Bhonsle and Sindhya nursed their wounds. In the south, the British armies led by Arthur Wallesley defeated the combined armies of Sindhia and Bhonsle at Asai in September 1803 and in Argonne in November. In the north, Lord Lake routed Sindhya's army at Loswari on 1 November and occupied Aligarh, Delhi, and Agra. Once again, the blind emperor of India became a pensioner of the company. The Maratha allies had to sue for peace. Both Sindhya and Bhonsle became subsidiary allies of the company. They ceded part of their territories to the British, admitted British residents to their court, and promised not to employ any European without British approval. The British gained complete control over the Orissa coast and the territories between the Ganga and the Jamuna. The Peshwa became a disgruntled puppet in their hands. Wallesley now turned his attention towards Holkar, but Yashwant Rao Holkar proved more than a match for the British and taught British armies to a standstill. Holkar's ally, the Raja of Bharatpur, inflicted heavy losses on Lake, who unsuccessfully attempted to Holkar family. Scindia began to think of joining hands with Holkar. On the other hand, the shareholder of the East India Company discovered that the policy of expansion through war was proving costly and reducing their profits. The company's debt had increased from 17 million pound in 1797 to 31 million pound in 1806. Moreover, Britain's finances were getting exhausted at a time when Napoleon was once again becoming a major threat in Europe. British statesmen and the directors of the company felt that the time had come to check further expansion, put an end to, ruinous expenditure, and to digest and consolidate British recent gains in India. Wallesley was therefore recalled from India and company made peace with Holkar in January 1806 by the Treaty of Raighat, giving back to the Holkar the greater part of his territory. Wallesley's expansionist policy had been checked near the end. All the same, it had resulted in East India Company become the paramount power in India. A younger officer in the company's judicial service, Henry Robert Clough, wrote in about 1805, "An Englishman in India is proud and tenacious. He feels himself a conqueror amongst a vanquished people and looks down with some degree of superiority on all below him." Expansion under Lord Hastings, 1813 to 1822. So the subsidiary alliance was made by Lord Wallesley. Let's see what is doing Lord Hastings in 1813 to 1822. The Second Anglo-Maratha War had shattered the power of the Maratha chiefs, but not their spirit. They made a desperate last attempt to regain their independence and old prestige in 1817. The lead in organizing a united front of the Maratha chiefs was taken by the Peshwa, who was smarting under the rigid control exercised by the British resident. The Peshwa attacked the British residency at Pune in November 1817. Appa Saheb of Nagpur attacked the residency at Nagpur and Madhavrao Holkar made preparations for war. The Governor General Lord Hastings struck back with characteristic vigor. He compelled Scindia to accept British sovereignty and defeated the armies of the Peshwa, Bhonsle and Holkar. The Peshwa was dethroned and pensioned off at Bithur near Kanpur. His territories were annexed and the enlarged presidency of Bombay brought into existence. Holkar and Bhonsle accepted subsidiary forces to satisfy Maratha pride. The small kingdom of Satara was founded out the Peshwa's lands and given to the descendant of the Chhatrapati Shivaji, who ruled it as a complete dependent of the British. Like other rulers of Indian states, the Maratha chiefs too existed from now on the mercy of British power. The Rajputana states had been dominated for several decades by Scindia and Holkar. After the downfall of the Marathas, they lacked the energy to reassert their independence and readily accepted British supremacy. Thus, by 1818, the entire India subcontinent, excepting the Punjab and Sindh, had been brought under British control. Part of it was ruled directly by the British and rest by host of Indian rulers, over whom the British exercised paramount power. These states had virtually no armed forces of their own, nor did they have any independent foreign relations. They paid heavily for the British forces stationed in their territories to control them. They were autonomous in their internal affairs, but even in this respect, they acknowledged British authority wielded through a resident. They were on perpetual probation. Then the consolidation of British power 1818 to 1857. The British completed the task of conquering the whole of India from 1818 to 1857. Sindh and the Punjab were conquered, and Awadh, the central provinces, and large number of other petty states were annexed. First, the conquest of Sindh. The conquest of Sindh occurred as a result of the growing Anglo-Russian rivalry in Europe, Asia, and consequent British fears that Russia might attack India through Afghanistan or Persia. To counter Russia, the British government decided to increase its influence in Afghanistan and Persia. It further felt that this policy could be successfully pursued only if Sindh was brought under British control. The commercial possibilities of the river Sindh were an additional attraction. The roads and rivers of Sindh were opened to British trade by a treaty in 1832. The chiefs of Sindh, known as Amirs, were made to sign a subsidiary treaty in 1839, and finally, in spite of previous assurance that its territorial integrity would be respected, Sindh was annexed in 1843 after a brief campaign by Sir Charles Napier, who had earlier written in his diary, "We have no right to seize Sindh, yet we shall do so, and a very advantageous, useful human piece of rascality it will be." He received 7 lakhs of rupees as prize money for accomplishing the task. The conquest of the Punjab. The death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh in June 1839 was followed by political instability and rapid changes of government in the Punjab. Selfish and corrupt leaders came to the fore. Ultimately, power fell into the hands of the brave and patriotic but utterly indisciplined army. This led the British to look greedily across the Satluj upon the land of the five rivers, even though they had signed a treaty of perpetual friendship with Ranjit Singh in 1809. Thus, the Punjab army let itself be provoked by the warlike actions of the British and their intrigues with the corrupt chiefs of the Punjab. In the autumn of 1848, news reached Punjab that boats designed to form bridges and had been dispatched from Bombay to Ferozpur on the Satluj. Barracks for additional troops were built in the forward area, and additional regiments began to be dispatched to the frontier with the Punjab. The Punjab army, now convinced that the British were determined to occupy the Punjab, took countermeasures. When it heard in December that Lord Gough, the commander-in-chief, and Lord Hastings, the governor-general, were marching towards Ferozpur, it decided to strike. War between the two was thus declared on 13 December 1845. The danger from the foreigner immediately united the Hindus, the Muslims, and the Sikhs. The Punjab army fought heroically and with exemplary courage, but some of its leaders had already turned traitors. The Prime Minister Rajlal Singh and the Commander-in-Chief Mysore Tej Singh were secretly corresponding with the enemy. The Punjab army was forced to concede defeat and to sign the humiliating Treaty of Lahore in 8 March 1846. The British annexed the Jalandhar Doab and Jalandhar Doab and handed over Jammu and Kashmir to Raja Gulab Singh Dogra for a cash payment of 5 million rupees. The Punjab army was reduced to 20,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, and a strong British force was stationed at Lahore. Later, on 16 December 1846, another treaty was signed giving the British resident at Lahore full authority over all matters in every department of the state. Moreover, the British were permitted to station their troops in any part of the state. From now on, The British resident became the real ruler of the Punjab, which lost its independence and became a vassal state. But the aggressively imperialist section of British officialdom in India were still unsatisfied, for they wanted to impose direct British rule over the Punjab. Their opportunity came in 1848 when the freedom loving Punjabis rose up in numerous local revolts. Two of the prominent revolts were led by Mulraj at Multan and Chattar Singh at Riwala near Lahore. The Punjabis were once again decisively defeated. Lord Dalhousie seized this opportunity to annex the Punjab. Thus, the last independent state of India was absorbed in the British Empire. Then Dalhousie and the policy of annexation 1848 to 1856. Lord Dalhousie came out to India as the Governor General in 1848. He was from the beginning determined the extended direct British rule over as large an area as possible. He had declared that the extinction of all native states of India is just a question of time. The underlying motive of this policy was the expansion of British exports to India. Dalhousie, like other aggressive imperialists, believed that British exports to the native states of India were suffering because of the maladministration of these states by their Indian rulers. Moreover, they thought that their Indian allies had already served the purpose of facilitating British conquest of India and could now be got rid of profitably. The chief instrument through which Lord Dalhousie implemented his policy of annexation was the doctrine of lapse. Very important. Remember it. Under this doctrine, when the ruler of a protected state died without a natural heir, his state was not to pass to adopted heir, as sanctioned by the age-old tradition of the country. Instead, it was to be annexed to British India. British India, unless the adoption had been clearly approved earlier by the British authorities. Many states, including Satara in 1848 and Nagpur and Jhansi in 1854, were annexed by applying this doctrine. Dalhousie also refused to recognize the titles of many ex-rulers of pay their pensions. Thus, the titles of the Nawabs of Carnatic and of Surat and the Raja of Tanjore was cancelled. Similarly, after the death of the ex-Peshwa Bajirao II, who had been made the Raja of Bithur, Dalhousie refused to extend his pay or pension to his adopted son Nana Sahib. Dalhousie was keen on annexing the kingdom of Awadh, but the task presented certain difficulties. For one, the Nawabs of Awadh had been British allies since the Battle of Buxar. Moreover, they had been most obedient to the British over the years. The Nawab of Awadh had many heirs and could not therefore be covered by the doctrine of lapse. Some other pretexts had to be found to deprive him of his dominions. Finally, Lord Dalhousie hit upon the ideas of alleviating the plight of the people of Awadh. Nawab Wajid Ali Shah was accused of having misgoverned his state and of refusing to introduce reforms. His state was therefore annexed in 1856. Undoubtedly, the degeneration of the administration of Awadh was a painful reality of its people. The Nawab of Awadh, like other princes of the day, were selfish rulers absorbed in self-indulgence, who cared little for good administration or for the welfare of the people, but the responsibility for this state of affairs was in part that of the British, who had at least since 1801 controlled and indirectly governed Awadh. In reality, it was the immense potential of Awadh as a market for Manchester goods which excited Dalhousie's greed and aroused his philanthropic feelings, and for similar reasons, to satisfy Britain's growing demand for raw cotton, Dalhousie took away the cotton producing province of bearer from Nizam in 1853. It needs to be clearly understood that the question of the maintenance or annexation of native states was of no great relevance at this time. In fact, there were no Indian states in existence at that time. The protected native states were as much a part of the British Empire as the territories ruled directly by the company. If the form of British control over some of these states was changed, it was to suit British convenience. The interest of their people had little to do with the change. So, this was the end of the third chapter, the European penetration and the British conquest of India.